Information is usually treated as an unquestioned good. Institutions invest enormous resources into collecting it, storing it, classifying it, analyzing it, and protecting it. Entire bureaucracies exist for the sole purpose of ensuring that more information is available to decision-makers at all times. The assumption is simple and rarely challenged. More information leads to better decisions lead to better outcomes, and better outcomes justify the system that produced them. In practice, this assumption often breaks down. Under certain conditions, information does not function as an advantage. It functions as a liability. This happens when information creates responsibility without authority, obligation without protection, and exposure without control. In those environments, knowing something does not empower action. It creates risk. Inside institutions, this dynamic develops quietly. People are encouraged to collect information, to analyze it carefully, and to surface potential problems. But they are not always empowered to act on what they find. Knowledge flows upward more easily than authority flows downward. As a result, possessing accurate information can place individuals in an unstable position. Once something is known, it cannot be unknown. Once a risk is identified, it cannot be unseen. And once a problem is documented, it creates an expectation of response. That expectation is where the cost appears. Responding to information often requires decisions that disrupt plans, challenge leadership, reallocate resources, or expose failure. When institutions are not prepared to absorb those consequences, information becomes something to manage rather than act upon. This is not because institutions dislike knowledge. It is because knowledge forces choice, and choice creates accountability. This episode examines how that shift occurs, why institutions often punish those who know too much rather than those who know too little, and how systems quietly train people to limit the depth and scope of what they are willing to discover. Because in many institutional environments, ignorance is not the absence of information. It is a form of protection. This is why information behaves differently inside large systems than it does in theory. In theory, identifying a problem is the first step toward solving it. In practice, identifying a problem creates an obligation that the system may not be prepared to meet. Once information exists, it demands a response. It requires explanation, justification, and often action. And action, inside institutions, is rarely neutral. Action redistributes responsibility. It exposes decision-makers. It forces trade-offs that may not align with existing priorities or political constraints. As a result, information becomes dangerous when it arrives without a clear, acceptable path forward. People who know too much often find themselves in a position where they can see the problem clearly, but lack the authority to resolve it. They are expected to inform others, persuade others, and wait for permission. That waiting carries risk. If the information is inconvenient, the person who holds it becomes associated with inconvenience. If the information implies failure, the person who surfaces it becomes associated with blame. Over time, this teaches a subtle lesson. It is safer to know what is expected to be known than to discover what creates obligation. It is safer to identify risks that can be managed than risks that require disruption. It is safer to participate in analysis that confirms existing direction than analysis that demands change. This is how institutions quietly regulate knowledge. Not by preventing access to information, but by shaping the incentives around discovering it. Knowing too much becomes costly, not because it is wrong, but because it forces the system to confront choices it would rather delay. The cost of knowing too much does not fall evenly across an institution. It concentrates in specific roles. Inside large systems, some people are expected to know more than others. Analysts, specialists, compliance officers, technical experts, and internal reviewers are tasked with identifying risks, failures, and vulnerabilities that senior leadership may never encounter directly. They are hired precisely because they can see what others cannot. But authority does not scale with knowledge. Those who know the most are often the least empowered to act. They are responsible for detection, not decision. Their role is to surface problems, not to resolve them. Once the information is produced, control over what happens next moves elsewhere. This creates a structural imbalance that shapes behavior over time. When someone with limited authority identifies a serious issue, they cannot fix it themselves. They must persuade others to act. That persuasion is not neutral. It carries personal and professional risk. If the information confirms existing priorities, it is welcomed. If it challenges timelines, budgets, reputations, or political constraints, it becomes inconvenient. The person who raised it becomes associated with the disruption it implies. Over time, people learn to anticipate this reaction. They learn which findings are safe to surface and which are better framed cautiously. They learn when certainty is rewarded and when it is treated as a threat. They learn how much clarity is acceptable before it becomes destabilizing. This learning does not require explicit instruction. It is absorbed through observation. People watch what happens to colleagues who insist too strongly, escalate too persistently, or refuse to soften conclusions. They notice who is invited back into decision-making conversations and who quietly disappears from them. Gradually, behavior adjusts. The scope of inquiry narrows. Language becomes more conditional. Risks are framed as emerging rather than urgent. Problems are contextualized rather than confronted. This is not dishonesty. It is adaptation to incentive. Institutions do not need to tell people to know less. They simply need to make knowing too much expensive. When producing information creates obligation without protection, individuals learn to protect themselves instead. They manage what they discover, how they describe it, and when they choose to escalate it. The result is a system that continues to collect information while quietly discouraging the kind of knowledge that forces action. Knowing too much becomes costly. Once knowledge becomes costly, institutions do not need to restrict access to information directly. They regulate how it is used. This regulation happens through process rather than prohibition. Information is welcomed, documented, and discussed, but action is deferred. Findings are acknowledged, but responsibility is displaced. Risks are noted, but ownership is unclear. This creates a familiar institutional pattern. People are encouraged to identify issues early, but discouraged from insisting on resolution. Problems are surfaced in meetings, recorded in reports, and then passed along to future reviews. Each step appears reasonable. Each step delays consequence. Over time, this produces a form of organizational equilibrium. Information continues to circulate, but its capacity to compel action weakens. Knowledge becomes something that exists alongside decision-making rather than something that drives it. This is not because leaders are unaware. It is because acting on certain information creates instability. When information threatens budgets, authority structures, or public legitimacy, it becomes easier to manage the information than to address the problem it describes. Institutions learn how to absorb knowledge without being changed by it. They create layers of review that transform urgency into process. They establish thresholds that redefine risk downward. They rely on consensus to delay action until responsibility is sufficiently distributed. The result is a system that appears highly informed and deeply analytical, while remaining strategically inert. Knowledge is present. Action is postponed. And those who continue to press for resolution are quietly reclassified from contributors to complications. This is how institutions maintain control while appearing transparent. They allow information to exist, but limit its ability to disrupt. The long-term effect of this dynamic is not ignorance, but selective blindness. Institutions do not fail because they lack information. They fail because they learn how to live with information they cannot afford to act on. Over time, people inside the system internalize this reality. They stop asking what should be done and start asking what can be defended. They stop evaluating information based on accuracy alone and begin evaluating it based on consequence. This changes how knowledge is treated at every level. Early warnings are softened. Certainty is avoided unless it is already shared. Risks are framed in ways that preserve flexibility rather than demand commitment. The goal becomes survivability, not resolution. This is where knowing too much becomes most dangerous. Those who continue to see problems clearly and insist on their implications become liabilities. They force the institution to confront choices it has learned to avoid. They create pressure that cannot be easily managed through delay or diffusion. As a result, they are isolated, not through punishment but through marginalization. Their influence shrinks, their access narrows, their role becomes advisory rather than directive. Over time, their presence is tolerated, but their impact is neutralized. Meanwhile, the institution adapts. It reorganizes itself around the information it has decided not to act on. Budgets are adjusted to manage consequences rather than prevent causes. Roles are created to monitor issues that will not be resolved. Language evolves to describe risk as permanent rather than urgent. This is how knowledge becomes background noise. Once this happens, failure becomes predictable. The system appears calm, informed, and in control. Reports continue to circulate. Oversight mechanisms remain active. There is no obvious crisis. But beneath the surface, the institution has already accepted outcomes it once would have considered unacceptable. This is the true cost of knowing too much. Not that information is ignored, but that it is absorbed without effect. And once an institution learns how to do this, acquiring more information does not improve outcomes. It simply expands the set of problems the system has learned to tolerate. Reversing this dynamic requires more than better data or stronger analysis. It requires change in what institutions lose when they choose not to act. Until that changes, knowledge will remain a risk, clarity will remain dangerous, and those who know too much will continue to bear the cost of a system designed to survive rather than respond.